Good afternoon. Does everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So we're streaming. It's a pleasure to, welcome Davide Spina to give the third lecture in our 7-part series entitled Architectures of Speculation, where we're considering the historical and contemporary relationship between with real estate speculation from urban developments associated with 19th century London, fin del siècle Paris, and post-war Rome, which is today's topic, to land ownership issues, spatial ordering of property, and buildings as financial instruments. Sorry, Siri is talking to me. I don't know what is happening here. Great. Anyways, sorry for that delay. But we're pleased to have Davide over Zoom this afternoon. Unfortunately, not in person, but given this, given the conditions here in Europe, it is understandable why. Davide is an architectural historian. For not too much longer, can we call him a doctoral candidate at the ETH, where he is finalizing and about to defend his dissertation, exploring the post-war activities of the Roman real estate developer and contractor, Società Generale Immobiliare, SGI. Prior to this, he completed an MA in architectural history at the Bartlett. He was the recipient of a collection research grant at the CCA, the Canadian Center for Architecture in 2016, a visiting PhD scholar at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and most recently, a architecture fellow at the Swiss Institute in Rome. At the ETH, he co-organizes the Architecture of Research, a yearly symposium on research methods, and the doctoral talks, an international online platform for graduate students in architectural and urban history. Many of his essays have appeared in the AA files, very nice essays. And well, I would just like to say that we're looking forward to the talk, and very rarely is it possible, and it was with great excitement to be able to put the word Vatican into a lecture series poster or into a public program. So I think it's very rare that we can do this, and I am happy that we can invite you to speak on this project. So at any rate, thank you so much, Davide, and we look forward to the talk.
Thank you, Salomon. Thank you for the generous introduction. Yes, indeed, today I will be talking about real estate, the Vatican and Rome. Okay, let me share my screen. Oops. Okay. So let's go back to the beginning. Right. Can you all see the lecture, the main slide?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Okay. So today I will talk about my PhD project on the Società Generale Immobiliare, or SGI, an Italian real estate developer and contractor of the 20th century. And the lecture will feature 3 main sections. First, I will talk a little bit about the company, about the history of the company. Second, there will be a few notes on the general aims of this research project. And third, this will be the largest part of the lecture, there will be a synoptic outline of the work. So roughly it will be 1 hour in total. So I would like to start with the image in a poster of this lecture. This is the cover of the 3rd edition of Italo Insolera's Roma Moderna, Modern Rome, a classic text on the urban history of the Italian capital, and shows an aerial photo of the affluent Balduina district. Built in the 1950s under the supervision of the Vatican-controlled real estate developer Società Generale Immobiliare, or SGI, Balduina has not otherwise registered in history books. Yet, the spirit of Italy's post-war middle class has never found a better place to call home, and the earthly business of the Vatican has never been so evident as in this corner of Rome. The story of Balduina and of SGI is in fact part of a larger story about how the dramaturgic needs of the Italian bourgeoisie and the economic goals of the Vatican got entangled in a large real estate venture that forever changed the face of the Eternal City. This story has its origins in the 19th century, but to a very great extent is a manifestation of the political divisions tearing apart Italian society at the end of the fascist regime. Politics in post-war Italy had an especially strong Cold War flavor, the communists and socialists on the left and the Christian Democrats on the right, doggedly against each other. The Christian Democratic Party, on the right, was created in 1943 as a political offshoot of Azione Cattolica, Catholic Action, a Roman Catholic association under the control of the Vatican, and was in power from 1948 to 1992, contributing more than any other political actor to what Italy is today. The Christian Democratic Party supported a class system, was pro-market and pro-American in outlook, and at least in the 1950s, faithful to the Vatican, to the extent that some historians called post-Italy, and I quote, the papal state of the 20th century, and in the 1950s, an age of Catholic triumphalism. Large swaths of the party were thus in the sway of the Vatican, which by now was an organization with large ramifications led by a Rome-born Pius XII. Here of the Gentile Pacelli family, Pius XII is considered by many the last real pope, in a sense of the last vicar of Christ, incarnating an almost monarch-like power. During his reign, the Vatican expanded considerably, branching out in finance, banking, and most importantly for an architectural audience, real estate. This economic expansion goes back to 1929, when the Mussolini government handed over to the Holy See 1.75 billion lire as a settlement for the losses suffered by the latter following the creation of the Kingdom of Italy in 1870, when the Church lost a large part of its revenue-generating property. The donation, a core item of the so-called Lateran Pax, occurred when the Vatican finances were at an all-time low and came as a sigh of relief for the small nation-state, which shortly after used a part of this capital to buy the majority stake of the real estate developer Società Generale Immobiliare, or SGI, hereafter. The Holy See's move into the property and construction businesses was in no small part a response to the Wall Street crash, which encouraged a strategy of diversification. But what kind of company was SGI, and why did the Vatican become its major shareholder? Here we go back to the 1860s. SGI was a large company whose history intertwined with the very history of the Italian nation-state and power structures. Italy, as a nation-state, was created in Turin in 1861, and SGI was created in the same city just 1 year later, in 1862, with a mandate to contribute to and capitalize from the modernization of Italy's building and infrastructural stock. SGI relocated to Rome following the latter's annexation to the Kingdom of Italy in 1870, and in the 1880s worked frenziedly as a contractor and developer during the post-annexation building boom, putting up a significant share of the many Umbertino-style blocks that account for most of late 19th century Rome. And here, for instance, we see the SGI-led transformation of the early modern Villa Ludovisi, in an area that is now known as Via Veneto, into a modern upscale residential district. By the 1920s, SGI developed land at full throttle in Italian capital and championed a new building type that was to dominate the cityscape for half a century, the Palazzina, or small palazzo, a medium-sized apartment block. And here we see two early palazzine by architect Marcello Piacentini, the favorite architect of the fascist regime. The Vatican takeover further propelled the business of the company, and in the 1930s, SGI continued to expand in Rome, concentrating on the residential segment. On the left is a gargantuan apartment block put up by the company in 1938, SGI's most conspicuous effort in the pre-war period, designed by Cesare Pascoletti, and on the right, a smaller development in the same area, a palazzina by Ugo Luccichenti, both speaking the language of fascist monumentality. Then came World War II. The conflict severely affected SGI's trade, but also offered it the chance to take a breath, restructure its organization, and set out ambitious plans for its involvement in the post-war reconstruction boom. During this period, the company was a wealthy architectural patron, a market leader, and enjoyed full financial and political support from the Vatican. With a staff of around 10,000, after the war, SGI completed around 700 contracts across the entire typological spectrum, from infrastructure to industrial, corporate, and residential developments. Post-war SGI worked with major architects like Luigi Moretti, top left, BBPR, top right, Ugo Luccichenti, bottom left, and Giuseppe Vaccaro and Adalberto Libera, bottom right. In the early 1960s, SGI expanded its operation internationally, and here we see SGI's two major schemes overseas. On the left, Place Victoria in Montreal, an office tower, and on the right, the Watergate complex in Washington, DC. So, to sum up, after World War II, SGI was a major company, a major architectural patron, and a major actor in the expansion of many Italian cities, especially Rome. And on top of that, it was controlled by a major political and religious organization, the Vatican, and therefore involved in Cold War politics. Despite such an extraordinary profile, SGI is virtually absent from books on architecture of post-war Italy. And I myself found out about it out of serendipity. As a master's student, I wrote a thesis on this building, the Ani building in Rome, an Italian emulation of corporate architecture in the United States, which I located in the context of a veritable mania for all things American in post-war Italy. And for my PhD, I initially intended to continue researching this topic and therefore look at the Italian suburban houses, chain hotels, drive-in theaters, and so on. And during this process, I kept on finding references to SGI, so I started looking into it and quickly found out about the extent of the company's production, which as we've seen, is really extraordinary. Likewise, as part of this preliminary inquiry, I also found out about the existence of an archive of the company. From there, it did not take long before I decided to put my regional research project on Americanization on a back burner, so to speak, and embark on a monographic study of SGI, a study that I'm now bringing to a close. Now, upon choosing to write about SGI, the first question that came to my mind was, why has not anyone written about this company? The lack of information on this corporation did not make sense to me, for SGI seemed too large an entity to go unnoticed by historians. And the more I researched it, the more it seemed to me the proverbial elephant in a room in the history of post-war Italian architecture. And so I identified three possible reasons for SGI's absence in our books. The first reason has to do with a political bias in a historiography of Italian architecture. For the most part, architectural histories of post-war Italy have focused on the work of progressive agencies, magazines, and architects, and disregarded the work of conservative outfits and architects. As a result, there is a great deal of scholarship on the episodic production of the left itself, say the Ina Casa program, the work of heroic figures like Vittorio Gregotti, Giancarlo De Carlo, BBPR, or the trajectories of cult magazines like Casabella and Contropiano, all pictured here, but almost none on a far more extensive production of the right, which is often dismissed as mere real estate speculation. And this sentiment is epitomized by movies like Francesco Rosi's Hands Over the City from 1963, a film that really cemented a taboo against real estate speculation in Italy, a taboo predicated upon a Manichaean language of good, left versus bad, right. The second reason behind SGI's absence in scholarship is a practical one, and has to do with the nature of their object of research, a construction conglomerate, and these kind of companies are notoriously secretive, and they generally leave no archives behind, so are very difficult to research. And these are SGI's executives looking very secretive themselves during the opening of a building by the company. The third and last reason, has to do with the nature of the products of these construction conglomerates, ordinary buildings or commercial architecture, generally shunned by architectural writers, critics, and historians because deemed unappealing. And this is a photo exactly of this kind of production, speculative development in 1960s Rome. So this research project appeared to me as a sort of corrective to all these biases. First, as an opportunity for a revision of the historiography of post-war Italian architecture. I wanted to study post-war Italian architecture, but also steer away from the analysis of all these architects/intellectuals to instead look at the work of a corporate entity. In other words, I wanted to write another parallel history of post-war Italian architecture from the perspective of business, something that had not been done before as regards Italy. And to move closer to the theme of this lecture series, speculation, I also saw this project as an opportunity to make signature buildings, ordinary buildings, and the reality of the construction industry and popular culture part of the same discussion, to study both the processes of production and consumption of the built environment, both the supply and demand of speculative building. And to zoom out even more, the project appeared to me as a means to stake some claims about my discipline. That is, that architecture history should be able to interrogate all sorts of buildings, including those that don't seem to have ideas attached to them, and an academic discourse should be able to address the reality of building production and not recoil from it. In other words, with this project, I wanted to test how one might write about the processes and products of real estate development, an industry that in recent years, architecture has become more and more a subset of. In the early stages of the project, I was inspired by two books in particular. On the left, George Summerson's Georgian London from 1945, a study both of architecture and the operations of the building industry, both of signature and ordinary architecture. On the right, Richard Goldthwaite's Building Renaissance Florence, an analysis of institutional patronage, construction practices, and social function of aristocratic buildings in 15th and 16th century Florence. What I admired in both books was exactly this discussion in the same text of both ordinary and signature architecture, and of both the supply and the demand of building services. The last question then was, how do you narrate the history of the real estate developer and contractor? This company was many things at once. First, the buildings it built, but also an employer, an architectural patron, a bureaucracy, a brand, a political actor, a human technical assemblage, and so on. This conundrum absorbed me for a while, but eventually came up with this thematic structure, which allowed me to delve into several issues of broader relevance in architecture. As you can see, is a structure made of doublets, so land and apartment buildings, organizational structure and architectural patronage, labor and technology, Americanization and historiography. So let's start with the first one, land and apartment buildings. This section looks at the company's planning and development strategies. As we have seen, in the post-war years, SGI was a national player, with a building program spanning the entire peninsula. But this program really pivoted on Rome, the city where the company's interests and network were strongest. When the war ended, SGI was the 5th largest landowner in Italian capital and the only company in a top 10 list. Others in the list being either aristocratic families or religious orders. So, as you can see, there's a predominance of families in patterns of land ownership in post-war Rome. Contemporary social commentary and archival sources indicate that SGI would normally buy and develop land in areas where it was thought the urbanization would have soon arrived, or develop land already owned by the company or available for cheap from families of the so-called black nobility. The black nobility is Rome's pro-Vatican, ultra-conservative, and ultimately unproductive aristocratic class. Planning-wise wheels that were oiled through the company's links with the city administration. The mayor of Rome in the 1950s, Salvatore Rebecchini, was not only a Christian Democrat, but also a civil engineer, and consistently proved more than obliging to the requests of the company. What we might call the Rebecchini system was, however, only the newest iteration of an older model of connivance between Rome's landed gentry and the office of the mayor. In fact, since 1870, 5 out of 6 city plans had been approved by a member or a representative of the papist aristocracy. SGI's choice method to make the land pay was not the sale of property, but of land itself. And in order to do this, they would consistently apply the same protocol. This would first entail the purchase of the large piece of real estate, whose core would be developed directly by the company, with upmarket residential buildings, complete with all the necessary facilities for a lavish lifestyle. And so this core would be this one. The presence of this expensive core would automatically raise the value of the surrounding land, the outer circle, which the company would then parcel up and sell to a number of small housing cooperatives. Each of these cooperatives would put up an apartment block or palazzina, generally financed with huge state loans, with attractive interest rates, and each of these palazzine in turn was designed and built under the supervision of SGI's in-house design office and contractor. Financially speaking, these operations were particularly profitable because of the city administration took charge of part, if not all, of the infrastructural work, relieving the developer of a major burden. SGI's new district were thus partly subsidized by the state and concocted under the eye of the company. And after SGI's job was done, independent small builders, right here, the so-called palazzinari, the builders of palazzine, would start cluttering the surrounding urban space with apartment blocks of inferior quality, also funded by the same government loans. So this is in a nutshell how SGI's developments propelled the expansion of the city at a geographical and typological level. And here is an example, the Balduina district, which an aerial photo of which we have seen in the first slide. And you can see in particular the expansive core right here with a church and soon to be a market, and around it just land parcel up and distributed to local developers. And this document by the company also features a list of all the cooperatives, all the names, and all the necessary information for SGI to supervise the development of the district. But how did the SGI people know what would sell? Almost all of SGI's staff came from areas of conservative Catholicism and were, quote, viscerally anti-communist and allergic to anything remotely leftist, end of quote. And likewise its clientele. The supply and demand of the SGI buildings were thus interlocked in the same ideology to create a powerful continuum between their production and consumption, a process aided by the company's sellers who telegraphed the desires of the customers to the design office. And this would be the spaces where this transmission would occur, the company's estate offices, On the left is an on-site estate office that speaks the same language of the SGI, of the buildings behind it. And then on the right, the company's main estate office in the company's HQ. And as to the OLEC's involvement in a company's design choices, it boiled down to the exercise of prescriptive power. And I read, "The Vatican only told us to avoid ventures incompatible with its role as the beacon of Catholicism. They never told us what to do, rather than what not to do," said an architect. A sort of one commandment table of the law that explains the company's manifold design output. For all the diversity in their forms and layouts, SGI's developments show a number of familiar features that are telling of the company's agenda and of the ideology of Christian democracy. The first thing that strikes one about the SGI developments is that an SGI-built church and community center complex would always be either in it or within walking distance from it. The second thing is that at the level of architectural language, the company had made a total break with pre-war production, as if in an attempt to erase its own fascist past. Take Balduina, the same district, the first large-scale development built by SGI after the war. On the right, sorry. Its main building did not look anything like the Viale Eritrea scheme, the last building by the company built before the war, on the left, even though they had been designed by the same architect, Cesare Pascoletti. Gone were the block-like symmetrical and stone-clad buildings on the 1930s in the left. In the 1950s, SGI embraced volumetric fragmentation, asymmetry, skewed angles, and the language of structural honesty, in some, a local iteration of the so-called international style. All these features seem the hallmark of architectural production in post-war Rome, a standard set at the higher echelons of the industry by architects like Luigi Moretti, who authored the first building of this kind, the Casa Girasole, here on the left from 1949, and then imitated down the hierarchy of glamour by high-end developers like SGI, and then by the large mass of speculative builders. Roman editor Bruno Zevi lambasted this trend as, quote, pseudo-modern commercial building, by which he probably meant, to borrow an off-cited definition, that this production displayed the physique of architectural modernism without its morale. In fact, the designers and clients of these buildings were not interested in modern architecture as an instrument for social reform, but as a weapon to be wielded in taste wars. Because ultimately, 1950s Rome was a highly polarized city. On the right end of the political spectrum, you have the glamorous La Dolce Vita style enjoyed by the Christian democratic elites. On the left, the dignified ordinariness advocated by the socialists and the communists. And here the catchword for the former was signorile, or aristocratic, and for the latter, popolare, or common. Two adjectives underpinning a binary opposition in a way specialists and laymen alike conceived of architecture. Signorili were the buildings put up by the middle-class housing cooperatives and by developers like SGI, and the word defines entire classes of buildings in a company's publications. And popolari were the ones by public housing programs like Una Casa. And this rift was strong and did not go unnoticed among foreign commentators. Rainer Banham mentions it in his famous Neo-Liberty piece, although he uses the word casalinga, the Italian for domestic, instead of popolare. While South African architect Gilbert Herbert inadvertently made it the subject of his two reports from Rome, the first on SGI's work in 1957, and the second one on Una Casa in 1958. A scheme was signorile when it featured elevators, marble, stucco, or wood finishes throughout, independent heating, hot water systems, air conditioning, and several expensive add-ons. SGI's flagship schemes in Rome had these attributes in spades, and on top sported a number of amenities essential for nurturing the car, body, and leisure cultures we were then booming on both sides of the Atlantic. And so stilt parking spaces and underground garages, swimming pools and tennis courts, large balconies and water fountains, movie theaters and commercial buildings, perimeter walls and guarded entries, all of which were lacking in a typical Una Casa scheme of the same years. One might say then that Signorile was too popolare, as SGI was too Una Casa, or to use a comparison from the other industry flourishing in Rome during those years, as Commedia all'Italiana was to Italian neorealism in cinema. On a closer look, the aristocratic character of SGI's environments was also predicated upon a certain degree of American glamour possessed by them, as suggested by California literary critic Donald Heine. And I read, in the elegant new quarters of Due Pini, one of SGI's flagship developments, the American could easily imagine himself in Evanston or Beverly Hills, an irresistible allure also supported by the presence of movie theaters in the mix. In a post-war period, cinema going was deemed by the church the most desirable leisure activity for people to get involved in, certainly more desirable than dancing, whose rock and roll iteration elicited mixed feelings of fear and censure among the clergy. Running a cinema then equaled to promoting certain standards of morality among the subjects of God, and in fact, many Italian parishes did run film shows in their backyards. But more than that, fostering film watching in 1950s Italy meant fostering the right ideological affiliations. As film director Federico Fellini put it many years later, and this is a quote from the ceremony, Oscar ceremony, when he received an Oscar for his contribution to cinema, I come from a country and I belong to a generation for which American movies were almost the same thing. So to sum up, SGI's development served the interests of the Vatican not only because they generated revenue, mostly through the sale of neighboring land, but also because they turned key items of the Christian democratic value system into bricks and mortar, namely support of Catholicism, amnesia of fascism, anti-communism, the enforcement of a class system, the ideology of home ownership, the embrace of American consumer culture, and a latent disregard for the Italian public good. Thus, these schemes set a standard for others developers to follow, alas, with vastly inferior means, with the consequences that are sadly evident to anyone visiting Rome's sprawling periphery outside the Aurelian walls. So this was the section on SGI's land and architecture strategies. The question then is now, how did the company deliver such a building program? And this is the subject of the next two sections. So as an actor invested in large-scale speculative building and aspiring to a state-within-state status, SGI relied on a huge bureaucratic apparatus for its day-to-day operations and long-term strategies. And now I will turn to the analysis of this apparatus. At any given moment, a bureaucratic order emerges to administrate large-scale complex processes. And in a case in hand, immediately after the war, SGI restructured its organization to play a major role in the reconstruction and expansion of Italy's building stock and infrastructure. Pre-World War II SGI was a rather small entity that did little contracting, preferring to outsource the process to local firms whenever possible. Post-war SGI, on the other hand, was a large creature that built with its own means. After the war, SGI created Sogene, a subsidiary company devoted to the delivery of schemes, complete with its own board members, premises, technical staff, workforce, and machinery. Shortly after, SGI strengthened its hierarchical structure, concentrating all the executive power on the company's new CEO, Aldo Samaritani, former bank accountant and colloquially called il dottore, the doctor, by the staff. An autocratic and paternalist leader, Samaritani would be involved in an unusually large range of decisions at SGI, from the choice of banks to loan from, to that of architects to work with. And key to this concentration of power was the improvement of SGI's in-house information management system. Until then, within the company, information flowed mostly top to bottom through a system of service orders, that is, orders given to the staff through paper sheets on the left. Samaritani introduced a new system to create instead a bottom-to-top information flow that allowed him to keep track of all the happenings within the company and give pointed instructions to the employees, the so-called report system, or sistema dei verbali in Italian, on the right. In this system, transcripts of meetings and personal reports will be regularly sent over to Samaritani himself, who would then review and return them with his comments and orders written in red pen within 24 hours. And you can see an example of one of these reports with Samaritani's signature style comment. So heaps of papers then passed through Samaritani's office every single day, a prodigious feat that consistently left both staff and relatives in awe. And in accordance to the strict record-keeping regime, copies of each report or meeting transcript was to be sent immediately stored in the company's archive, also established by Samaritani in 1945. And this archive that Samaritani established is essentially the archive that I worked on. For all his control mania, though, the CEO of SGI still had to delegate a great deal, especially decisions on design, which he, as an accountant, knew little about. To this end, he drafted two unusually quantitative-minded and bureaucratic profiles, Emilio Pifferi, architect, on the left, and Alberto Ressa, civil engineer, right. Pifferi and Ressa, respectively SGI's main architect and head of the SGI design office, were both from Turin, Italy, Italy's main industrial hub and the epicenter of Anglo-Saxon positivism in the country. To different degrees, both Pifferi and Ressa had been dabbling with theories of scientific and bureaucratic management long before joining SGI, a fact that must have certainly attracted Samaritani, the boss, while he was shopping for design executives in the mid-1940s. But the delegation of tasks had to be extended down the chain of command, and so in the late 1940s, the company embarked on a hiring spree of architects, engineers, surveyors, draftsmen, and typists. By 1955, some 500 people hierarchically grouped in 12 ranks worked in the company's headquarters in Rome, and as you can see, precisely 558. And this is the SGI headquarters, a typical early 20th century mixed-use building in central Rome. A glance at the personal files in the company's archive reveals that certain bureaucratic traits were sought for in the candidates, be it, and I quote, a well-developed economic sense coupled with technical competence, or a firm character, a disinterest in politics, or exemplary morals. Faceless and anonymous. Thus was the perfect SGI employee. The same, however, cannot be said of the process whereby these people were hired, which at the beginning of SGI's organizational expansion seemed far from impersonal. Throughout the late 1940s and early 50s, in fact, SGI was not immune from the peculiarly Italian system of raccomandazioni, or backings in English. The company's records are rife with letters from industry executives, Christian democratic politicians, and even Vatican officials, interceding for this or that person, not on the basis of merit, but the client ties with the person writing. And here we see a letter by no less than Italian Ministry of Public Works, who personally backed or recommended, in this case, is an engineer. As to the design process, until 1945, the latter was routinely outsourced to select local firms, so that blueprints would only appear in the SGI headquarters for reviews by the company's in-house engineering and contractor teams. But as the company took on design duties in the post-war years, an actual design office was called for, and in a clear attempt to enforce a division of labor, in 1949, SGI actually resolved to create two. One for architectural drawings, so drawings at a scale 1 to 100, and one for working drawings, drawings at a scale 1 to 50. The former was the largest, employing circa 30 people in a purpose-built lightweight structure on top of the Rome headquarters. And here you can see a section of the design office, as you can see, sitting on top of the old building. And this is a view of the interior. Everybody, as you can see, is wearing the typical white coat. Compare this space with the offices of Luigi Mattioni and Marcello Piacentini, among the largest and best organized in the country at that time. And I struggled to keep the scales of the drawings identical, so one can see the differences. So this is the office of Luigi Mattioni, Milan, which, as you can see, seems to be within an older building. It looks like a residential building. And here is the plan of Piacentini's office. This is a purpose-built building by Piacentini himself, designed by him. But as you can see, again, it's quite crammed. The SGI office was much bigger and more efficiently structured, thanks to its grid and panoptical layout, which allowed for little slack in a workforce. And as you can see, this was a rationale that really determined the design of this space, as you can see from this cone of vision that is represented also in the plans. But what kind of designers worked in these offices? Well, it needs to be said that as a conservative outfit, SGI preferred to fill its positions with engineers. For in 1950s Rome, the education of engineers and architects was more similar than it is today. But engineers had tended to be more conservative in outlook than architects. And in those years, the architecture school in Rome was already drifting to the left. But since the company's main clients were urban elites, social groups historically concerned with issues of self-representation, lots of architects, the self-representation experts, also worked in SGI main building. The profile of the average SGI architect perfectly aligned with Henry Russell Hitchcock's definition of the bureaucratic architect, the designer integrated in free market economics. After World War II, SGI hired many of them to eventually create, and I quote, a stable of draught horses, modest but efficient workers, essential for large-scale commercial operations, end of quote. And in a Rome job market, landing one of these equine gigs was a much coveted prospect. For even La Dolce Vita years, being an architect in the Italian capital was not exactly synonymous with professional fulfillment and financial ease. Here is one of these architects relating his experience in this respect, and I read, SGI had a bad reputation because money was all that mattered to them. I was at ill at ease in there because I dreamt of becoming a planner, but SGI offered a nice paycheck. One might say that they literally bought people. So SGI employed plenty of these human types, all to different degrees caught in a veritable Faustian pact with the company. For all SGI's ability to design everything in-house, on special circumstances they turned to outside help, to the so-called external collaborators in SGI's jargon. This would happen, for instance, if the typological and technological challenges posed by a scheme exceeded the company's in-house expertise. or if getting planning permission on a scheme was predicted to be particularly difficult, as was the case for the Rome Hilton on the right, designed by Ugo Luccichenti. Generally, the more ambition the scheme at hand, the more SGI would seek the services of respected local designer. SGI hired them, and I quote again, to get schemes through the town hall using their soft skills and network. And these were not mere expectations on SGI's part, but conditions that the company specified in its contracts with them. It could be said then that these external collaborators acted as intermediaries or even as solicitors on behalf of SGI. And here we see a particularly telling image in this regard, Luigi Moretti, perhaps Italy's foremost architect in the post-war period, perorating SGI's cause in front of the US Commission of Fine Arts during the planning stages of the Watergate schemes. As you can see, Moretti here is clad in full, he's in full oratorial garb, dressed like a Roman senator. So as a provider of white-collar work, SGI was a large bureaucracy led by an autocratic figure, steeped in clientelism and selectively hiring signature architects whenever going through the red tape proved difficult. Now let's see, on the other hand, how the company operated as a provider of blue-collar work. All the SGI developments were delivered by the company's in-house contractor, Società. And we see here a Società site in front of St. Peter's. Società was the largest contractor in Italy, with a staff of around 9,000 people and a modus operandi not far from national standards in the industry. In the post-war years, construction was the fastest rising sector of the Italian economy, and largely a low-tech effort because of the presence of one single element, cheap labor. We see navies here breaking rocks, a rather common sight in post-war Rome. Now, there were several reasons for the presence of this element, cheap labor. The first reason is demographic and has to do with the presence of an immense reserve of human power in the Italian countryside, mostly migrant workers who would commute daily to the city and for whom precarious work in construction proved the common, if not the only, option to get by. The second reason for the presence of cheap labor is the repressive character of the Christian democratic governments of the 1950s, all staunchly anti-labor and all too keen on unleashing state violence against dissenting workers in order to protect the interests of contractors. And the tool for effecting this repression was the so-called celere units, motorized anti-riots units of the Italian police, created immediately after the war and equipped with American jeeps and trucks. And we see here a still from Bicycle Thieves, the famous neo-realist film, and a photograph of a street clash in Rome in the late 1950s with the celere units beating the protesters. The third reason for the presence of cheap labor is directly related to the latter and has to do with the balance of power in labor relations in Italian construction at this point in time, markedly pro-capital because of low unionization rates among construction workers. In fact, the intermittent character of construction work and the semi-nomadic lifestyle of its workers consistently discouraged unions from establishing a strong presence in this sector after World War II. And these are Società workers queuing for the paycheck. All these factors made for very harsh working conditions on site, and in the thesis I do talk about these in detail, about the uncomfortable, unsafe, and unsanitary condition of Società's blue-collar staff, their hopeless destitution, disposable status, and struggle to change this situation through union action. I hear someone typing in the background. Machines are also part of this story, for there's one thing that, apart from size, sets Società apart from its competitors, was exactly a much higher level of mechanization in its sites, where you would regularly see American excavators, bulldozers, and cranes, all acquired for cheap through the Marshall Plan. And here we see an American excavators at Ruston Bicyrus at work in a Sogene site in Rome in front of Bernini's colonnade by St. Peter's. Now, the use of this class of machines substantially increased the speed and scale of Sogene's work, which in turn resulted in much higher yields for SGI. But combined with the complete absence of safety protocols, the appearance of these machines also subjected the Sogene workers to new and even deadlier occupational hazards, generally contributing to a worsening of work conditions among the company's blue-collar staff. In short, SGI's expansion in post-war Rome relied on high levels of labor exploitation, a phenomenon endemic at a national level and tacitly supported by the Christian democratic governments of the 1950s. And technology, American technology in particular, was consequential in a rolling out of this building program. And this leads to the last section of the talk, which is on SGI's contribution to the Americanization of Italy and to the impact that the company's activities in this field had on the discipline of architectural history in the country. As we have seen in the 1950s, SGI's flagship developments featured amenities that were not found elsewhere in Rome, and that made these developments highly appealing to the local American community. And this is the Due Pini development. As you can see, it has a swimming pool. You cannot see it, but it also has a gym, tennis courts, parking space, and so on. For the record, a substantial share of this community was involved in filmmaking in the Cinecittà Studios, which at this point in time is probably the largest hub for the production of American movies outside the United States, and hence its nickname. It was called Hollywood on the Tiber in the 1950s and 60s. Now, given the commercial success of these ventures in the 1950s, in the 1960s, the company started to ramp up its effort to cater to Americans, as well to all the expats and locals persuaded of the American way of life. The Casal Palocco suburb in Rome, on the left, was the first and most conspicuous effort in this respect, by and large an emulation of suburbs that the SGI staff had visited around Los Angeles and New York. Located near to Fiumicino on the right, Rome's first airport of the jet age, Casal Palocco was a very large and lucrative development, and at the same time, one that caused absolutely no trouble to SGI because of its suburban location, away from the pressure of the city and from prying eyes, especially those of the communist press, which never really cared to comment on it. SGI's other main effort to cater to an American community was the Rome Hilton, a large building tacked onto the crest of Monte Mario, the highest hill in Rome, near St. Peter's. And you can see the Dome of St. Peter's here. It's probably a 10-minute drive from the two buildings, between the two buildings. This is not a building that you will find in books of modern Italian architecture, which is striking given the impact that it had not only on the history of modern Rome, but also, I would argue, on the trajectory of Italian architectural history. And the reason why this building managed to make such a big impact does not rest in its formal or material qualities, but in its abysmal critical fortune. In other words, this is a building that became important not because of its sensational qualities, but for the discourse that it created. And the story of this building is a key element in this discourse. The Rome Hilton was a joint venture of SGI and Hilton Hotels International, who in 1950s shook hands to build the largest hotel in the Italian capital. The two giants were looking to open the hotel within 4 or 5 years, so around 1955, but they had not taken into consideration the possibility of opposition to the project by the local Communist Party. Upon hearing by the hotel, in fact, the Roman communists immediately took aim at it, seeing in it not entirely without reason, a manifestation of American hubris, ecclesiastical favoritism, and corporate despotism. And for the record, the hotel was planned in a non-building zone, so in complete disregard of all existing regulations. After 10 years of debates, however, the Roman red tape finally gave way and construction was given the green light. The hotel was then complete in 1963, but at the cost of unhealthy amounts of bad press for SGI. And in the center, you see snippets of anti-SGI features, just a selection, of course. And on the right, you see current Hilton himself kissing the hand of Rome's Cardinal Vicar prior to the opening of the hotel. Now, the key actors in this anti-Hilton, anti-SGI campaign were not only the Communist Party and press, but also a few more center-leaning cultural associations. The most engaged of them was Italia Nostra, or Italy in Italian, an association dedicated to the preservation of historical buildings and parks, very active from the late 1950s onwards. And what's of our interest today is that Italia Nostra was not only the haunt of progressive urbanites resolved to protect their cities from barbaric developers like SGI, but also as the breeding ground for several young architects who later go on to found the so-called Venice School of Architectural History. Most importantly, Mario Manieri Elia and Manfredo Tafuri, whose writing appeared in an association's journal several times and who both had a personal stake in a Rome Hilton story. In the mid-1950s, Manieri Elia had worked for the architect that co-designed the building, Ugo Luccichenti, an architect on SGI's payroll, while Tafuri allegedly grew up in a building designed by the same architect. So there is a thin line connecting this Vatican American real estate venture, the related corporate lobbying and corruption, the ensuing media controversy, and the failings of the civil society in opposing the scheme, with the birth of a kind of historical writing obsessed with the consorting between architecture and capital and with the idea of failure itself. A kind of writing which would prove very influential in Italy and beyond, permeated by sense of hopelessness, by pessimism, and by a fundamental loss of faith in the discipline of architecture. Of course, there were also other ingredients in a Venice school mix, most importantly, a heavy dose of critical theory, a philosophy not by chance developed to make sense of failure. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that Tafuri and its associates' early involvement in civic activism and historical preservation contributed to their ideological trajectory more than historians have cared to admit so far. So what I do in this last part of the thesis is tracing a history of the theory, a sort of prehistory of the Venice School told through the history of the Rome Hilton, which is this object looming in the background. The underlying idea being that ideas always emerge out of specific real-world conditions. And as A.H. Carr famously said, study the historian before you begin to study the facts. And in the same way in which the Rome Hilton contributed to the birth of something new in a realm of ideas, it contributed to the demise of something old in a realm of business. Completing this scheme, in fact, was the beginning of the end for SGI, for the 10-year-long media controversy spurred by the planning of the building marred the company's reputation beyond reparation, creating a toxic environment that made more and more difficult for the company to get building permits across the peninsula. The Rome Hilton controversy, at the same time, really put the Vatican's earthly interests under the public eye, as did the controversy spurred by the Watergate complex in DC, another overambitious venture by SGI that began exactly as the Hilton operation was coming to fruition. So by the late 1960s, the Vatican had grown very impatient with the situation of its construction conglomerate, also because in the meantime, the property market had reached saturation, national politics had drifted to the left, and labor costs had risen dramatically, factors that de facto had caused SGI to become unprofitable. Publicly lambasted and economically useless, SGI was then doomed to fade into obscurity. In 1969, the Vatican decided to pull the plug on the company by selling the shares to a group led by shady businessman Michele Sindona, pictured here. And they would then go on to concentrate on banking and stocks, more discrete forms of investment, a measure consistent with the global economy's shift from manufacture to finance, then just at the beginning. Without the protection of the Holy See and under increasingly more incompetent management, SGI's trajectory began a slow descent until bankruptcy in 1987. Just a few years before the end of the Christian democratic hegemony in 1992. So what are the takeaway points from this story? There are many, I think, but the main two are probably that the history of SGI is deep down the history of modern Italy, especially its post-war phase, and that the history of this company is paradigmatic. In other words, that it is in embryo, a model for many of the dynamics that we find in a neoliberal city today. As I have tried to show, public support of private accumulation, the use of architecture as a means of social polarization, the banality or corporate evil in a real estate business, and the brazen exploitation of migrant labor, all phenomena that did and continue to steer the way we talk about architecture. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Davide, for the very nice talk, simultaneously sharing your method of research and the broader context or issues. A few of our students have a question. Nishi, shall we start with you?
Yeah. Hello.
And Daniel, if you have a question, please also feel free to interject. So, Nishi.
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much for your informative lecture. Your research deals with this post-war Rome, which is almost like this experimental phase for architects where every architect is trying to find their own breakthrough from fascism style of architecture. And I was interested in this affiliation or this collaboration of SGI with the architects which they hired in terms of the freedom these architects had in their designing. So were there any restraints or restrictions posed by the SGI in terms of design during this experimental phase of post-war Rome?
Well, this is a great question, and that's actually something I intended to talk about in a lecture, but since you just cannot basically talk about everything that you've been written on the book, I had to make a selection. But broadly speaking, SGI hired architects, as I mentioned, to get through the red tape. And what they would normally do is establish the general massing and the program of the buildings, and they would leave to the architects the job of basically cladding the mass of the building. So this is, I think this is kind of quite telling. So SGI was basically looking for facade architects.
But you also mentioned that there were certain popular architects who paired up with SGI, right?
Yeah, that is very true. And probably I have to sort of clarify that this, what I just mentioned, was the protocol for the standard developments, but on certain occasions, definitely in the case of the Watergate complex, of the I mean, these really, really large, really important schemes, they would let the architects, you know, have a much deeper impact on the program of the building.
Maybe just to piggyback on that, so something like the Watergate site. So who was doing really that land speculation? I mean, how would that work? So who, in terms of, you know, scouting locations, you know, was that seen as prime real estate? Was that seen as affordable? Was it, you know, what is the backstory to a selection in something like that?
I mean, that by now, I think it's a well-known story in the sense that there are a few books that deal with that. The Watergate is not really part of my thesis because of time constraints. I had to focus on the Italian.
No, or any of the other, or any of the other more speculative pieces of real. I mean, outside of the housing, just more of these, office buildings, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's many of these ventures started out of chance, and you know, it's. This is an organization of businessmen that talk to other businessmen, and you know, when you go through the documents, you know, there are mentions to this meeting happening in this club, and you know, we started talking about the possibility of building this or that there. So I guess that there was no sort of overarching rationale behind the choice of these sites. Just to go into the specifics, the Watergate site was not considered prime real estate. It was the location in the mid-1950s. There were gasworks there, and it was a sort of how do you call it, cutaway site. It was sort of in Elephant's plan. It didn't really the plan of Washington didn't really design the edges of the river. So I think it was just a happy coincidence that they managed to buy it, and also I think it was cheap. On the other hand, you know, the other main building I talk in this presentation is the Hilton. The Hilton, in that case, they definitely went for a plot that they knew that would have guaranteed a certain level of conspicuousness of the scheme. So I guess that it was always a sort of compromise. Sometimes it might have been the choice would be based on whether the plot was cheap and, you know, had promise of huge yields. Sometimes, in the case of the Rome Hilton, it was a matter of choosing the most conspicuous plot. I don't know if that answers the question.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
Yes, thanks for the lecture. It was truly interesting. So following the previous questions, you were talking about SGI that actually shaped the Italian society and made an effort to manipulate urban manners in a way at the time where the nation was struggling for a reason. So my question would be, how did they know what would sell?
How did they know what would sell in terms of what buildings would sell?
And yes, in terms of, yes. Okay.
Well, I mean, again, as I mentioned, they had a huge team of sellers, and sellers were really in contact with the prospected customer base. And so there was a system whereby sellers could telegraph, you know, convey relevant information in this respect to the design team. And also, it was just by hiring the right, hiring designers from the right demographics. So basically, the people designing the buildings belong to the same demographics of the people who would buy these buildings.
Okay, thank you.
Next.
Maybe I have a small question. Oh, sorry. Go first, Michael.
Sure. Thank you, Davide. So this post-war period, right? This is a period where there's also a lot of developments in media technology. And during your presentation, you also showed some first some first color photography, and you talked a bit about cinema. And so I was reading a bit, and I found out that the Rome Olympics of 1960, where they were also the first Olympics to be televised, right? And I was wondering during your research, your visual research, I guess, if you have looked at films or other depictions or representations which really nicely showed these SGI projects.
Yeah, that's a good question, and this is something that I meant to talk about how I actually did this. Actually, I'm doing it because it's not over yet. But I usually run extensive surveys of cinema, and I've watched, I don't know, dozens, if not hundreds, which is great. It's mostly Italian cinema from the 1950s and 60s, but both auteur movies, but also a lot of B movies. And yes, and indeed, there are some parallels between the expansion of the city and the expansion of cinema as an industry. And as a matter of fact, many filmmakers in Rome in the 1950s were using new development, like the developments, like SGI's developments, as locations for whatever stories they wanted to tell.
Do you perhaps have some specific examples of filmmakers or titles?
I mean, the Balduina district, which I talked about a few times, featured in La Dolce Vita, for instance, Federico Fellini's. But then Fellini, quite a few. I think there's also some Antonioni, and then also a plethora of lesser-known Italian directors. And I guess it had to do with the fact that, shooting in these environments was also cheaper.
Great, thanks.
I wondered about whether you could elaborate a bit on the role of the Vatican Bank, which, of course, we know as also being founded by Pius XII as well, and how, let's say, the ties to let's say the funding of a lot of these projects, was that through the Vatican Bank, or was that actually other banks involved in the city of Rome?
Well, actually, it needs to be said that SGI was not completely owned by the Vatican. The Vatican had the majority stake, but there were also other major entities within the board, most importantly Fiat, the country's main car manufacturer. And so this to say that SGI had very strong links to the Italian business community, to the Italian finance community. And so they would normally borrow money from other banks. So banks that, Banco di Santo Spirito, Banca Commerciale Italiana, banks, however, that had also very historical links to the Vatican, but not directly from the Vatican Bank, I would say.
But also, I would presume that it's not only the banks having the relationship to the Vatican, but also the corporations, right? So, yeah. I mean, there are reasons why there's diocese and archdiocese, and why there's a kind of hierarchical structure, network structure, in terms of Catholic capitalism, for lack of a word.
It was. Yeah. I mean, you can imagine in Italy, the church has a very tentacular reach. So I guess that proved very helpful.
Does somebody else have a question?
I maybe have a question, Davide. I was interested. It was a fascinating talk, and I kind of share your enthusiasm for Summerson and his sort of equivalent interrogation of the way London was built, or that period of London was built. and of course, one can see many parallels. In fact, a little side question is, we're working in a building at the moment owned by Generali in big Italian
insurance.
And I wondered whether there was any connections. But actually, the real question I wanted to ask is, I mean, you spoke about they kind of depict these buildings as a kind of backdrop to Fellini and Antonioni, and so in a way they also project the image of post-war Italy to everybody else, to the rest of the world. And you've seen a lot of these buildings, I guess, as part of your research, and I wondered what you thought of them. I mean, I'm interested in whether, because, one sees parallels in the work of someone like Seifert in London, who at the time was derided, but actually the buildings have many qualities. I mean, he was in some ways a very powerful architect. And so, I'm kind of interested in what you think about them as a stock, as a building stock.
Right. I mean, am I supposed to make a value judgment here?
Yeah, if you like.
Yes.
Okay.
You don't have to play historian.
Well, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of them. And I can very well see why people have not been looking at them for so long, because, again, what I wanted to also say is that when you look in a commercial architecture like this one, the only way you can this research interesting is by basically exploding the narrative so much that you actually look at so many actors, and then you are able to reconstruct an interesting narrative. And then that's when the building becomes interesting, because if you just go to Rome and walk through the streets of Balduina, you will not be impressed for many reasons. The formal qualities of the buildings are not impressive. You need to know what these buildings are about. So more than if you were looking at I guess what I'm trying to say is that appreciation of these buildings rests on prior knowledge of what these buildings stand for and what they manifest. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, I think that's a nice way to conclude the talk. So
thank you so much.
Sure.
It was great.
So thank you for really outlining, well, again, a clear story, but also sharing the way one approaches a project. And I very much like this idea. Well, I like the end comment here. That's why I sort of want to end with this, based on Daniel's comment, is that one doesn't have to necessarily love the building or the set of buildings or put things on pedestals. And I very much appreciate this idea of what a research means, and then exactly that you explode the narrative, and that it's about looking critically at a set of processes, and you've outlined these very clearly in your structure, and that is that sort of, it's not only an institutional history, but also a history of the buildings, but not putting them as kind of exemplars to be presented as the best of the best, right? So I think to the students especially, I think this is important, that when one does a kind of research project or a scholarly investigation, that it's not just putting, that if one does that, it doesn't mean that that's a precedent to be praised on, right? That there's a kind of critical inquiry that is being done. Because I mean, I can imagine that once the book comes out, right, it's not about putting these buildings on pedestals and every architecture student's trying to now scan plans and look at them as very particular, well, as good pieces of architecture. I mean, as you alluded to, it's in, I don't remember if it was the lecture or at the very first question, but stating that these projects were basically facade projects, right? So I mean, that already alludes to a whole bunch of other things. But anyways, thank you so much, Davide, and well, I hope we will see each other in person soon. Yeah. So yeah. So bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.